Practice versus theory. The idea that someone can say that they can do whatever they want, and you can't tell them what to do, they don't tell you what to do, they don't tell you how to run your life. In theory, you might think it's plausible, but even in theory, it doesn't make sense. In practice, you see that doesn't make sense. If one person is allowed to just smoke in public, everyone is allowed to. Who's to say that they're not allowed to? Who's going to stop them? Who's to say all of them won't do it at the same time? So what happens to the person who doesn't want to smell the smoke, who lives a life without smoking? You force that person to live a smoker's life. So it's the idea of too much freedom equals someone else's, loss of freedom. You're taking away other people's freedoms. You're taking away other people's respect, their health, their privacy, their safety. The same thing with public nudity, or pornography, or sexual indecency, sexual immodesty, immorality. Your behavior, your attire, your conduct. Raising a child is more than just telling them what to do, it's telling them what not to do. The problem isn't only when someone tells them to do something bad. It's when they don't tell them anything. They don't tell them to do good. They don't explain why it's bad. They aren't an example. They aren't around. And I think humankind is ready for the age of miracles. Jews are no longer worshiping statues or idols. They no longer have this historical, biblical addiction, this addiction to, as shown in their scriptures. They kept going to these idols, worshiping false idols and stuff like that. They no longer have that. People are more rationalistic, reasonable, scientific, more common sense. And whatever you raise them with, they will become. Look at these people raising children to be SJWs, to be drag, to be transgender. Those are the bad things, but you could also do that with good things. Even though the Middle East is raising people systematically on mass production level, these Muhammads of terrorism, with Islam, you can also create and systematically mass produce Jesus Christs. In a democracy, I asserted that, look at atheist governments, right? Compare that to Judeo-Christian governments like Israel, where you can be an atheist, you can be Christian, you can be homosexual, you can live in freedom and peace and love, prosperity. But in an atheist government, you have communism, you have Karl Marx, you have Stalin, Mao Zedong, etc. But also, in a democracy, the idea that atheism is incomplete is that it's nothingness, it's not a solution. Democracy is incomplete too. Because depending on what the demographic is, they could democratically decide to make evil things, In a sense, every nation is a democracy if, whether they're good or bad. If they decide to do bad, evil together, that's democracy. If they decide to do good together, that's democracy. So democracy is incomplete. Mere democracy doesn't make things good. Democracy is like a synonym to free will. Simply because you have free will doesn't make you a good person. You need to raise that child. You need to raise that dog. You need to raise, indoctrinate, and to culture this people, this nation. And as I said, that atheism doesn't work. It's nothingness. There's no do's and don'ts. There's no good and bad. There's no actual raising, because one of the problems is when you don't do anything, when you don't say anything. It's like having no father. Like, what's the use of having a physical father around if they don't talk to you, they don't raise you, It's like you don't have a father, practically. You just don't. The same way, if you have a quote-unquote democracy, but you don't have this Judeo-Christian moral, this role model, Jesus Christ as a role model, as a good neighbor, as a father figure, and you're not saying, you know, the golden rule, you're not being the example of the golden rule, and you're not enforcing it, then that's the idea of practice versus theory. In your theory, you think it's plausible to just do whatever you want and to let people do whatever they want and to do nothing, to say nothing, to enforce nothing, to restrict nothing. But in the end, what you have is people who are taking away other people's freedoms, their human rights. You know, what if everyone was a misogynist or a pig or a racist, and then the majority said, oh, okay, it's okay. And then you had in every TV show and every film in the House, because quote unquote democratically they all agreed upon it. It's a majority rule. So it's not about white people, it's not about black people, it's not about Asian people, it's not about, you know, colors. It's about good example, good father figure, good role model, good culture, good practices. You know, when you raise a child, when you raise a dog, when you raise people, when you indoctrinate people, when you govern people, it's more than about that person or that dog's well-being. It's more than about making sure they're happy. It's about everyone else. You have a responsibility. Are you gonna raise a monster? Are you gonna unleash a demon you didn't raise, you didn't domesticate, or you taught evil things to? You know, it's not in theory plausible. In theory, it makes no sense. You know, theory versus practice, practice versus theory. Even in theory, if you really think about it, the theory is wrong. You think it makes sense, but you have to think a little bit more and realize that actually it's not. An individual is in society, is in the world. You know, if they're a problem, then they're our problem. They're a threat to us. They're a problem for us. They're in our vicinity. They're in our world. They can always creep. They can always spread, infect, be contagious, be dangerous, be hazardous. So it's not about I can do whatever I want or I can let them do whatever they want. It's not harmless. It doesn't come without consequence. It doesn't work in practice nor theory.